Good morning, everybody. I'm Nicola Barrett, Chief Corporate Learning Officer at Emory Executive Education at Goizueta Business School. And it's wonderful to have you all join us this morning. Over the last 3 decades or so, billions of dollars have been invested in community-oriented policing approaches that are meant to promote trust between officers and civilians. However, as we mostly all know, trust in law enforcement remains at an all-time low. Today, we're going to hear insights from research about an approach to building that very much needed trust that came from a field experiment of community members interacting with police officers. The research highlights an underappreciated reason why authority figures so often fail to promote positive relationships with those over whom they have power, and then a fairly easy approach to resolve this. To guide us in today's session, we're excited to welcome Andrea Dittmann, Assistant Professor of Organization and Management at Goizueta, as we discuss how a transparency statement impacts interactions across power disparities. Andrea studies the sources of and solutions to inequality in the workplace. And in all her work, Andrea ultimately seeks to take insights from research to develop interventions that promote equity and inclusion in organizations. Andrea is going to share her insights from research consisting of over 500 hours. I can't even think about how many weeks that would be, months that would be. 500 hours of naturalistic observations and a field experiment of community members interacting with police officers to show that civilians were less threatened and reported greater trust when officers added a short transparency statement, communicating their good intent at the beginning of any interaction they had with civilians. And I think there could be some interesting parallels to other occupations and interactions. So looking forward to discussing that. But before I hand things over to Andrea, I do want to highlight that we are taking applications for the Goizueta Executive Women's Leadership Program that starts August 15. So this is a program that provides women leaders with the opportunity to really hone their storytelling abilities, develop their personal leadership narrative, and discover ways to leverage both of those more effectively to drive strategic organizational change. For anyone interested in the power of well-crafted messages and examining attitudes on assertiveness, I invite you to join us for a lead-up webinar conversation to the women's program. And this conversation will be held on April 28th. And it's really a data-driven discussion on perception and gender with Professor Karen Sedetol and guest speaker Cami Rice. We'll put the link to that in the chat, and that's open to everybody and anybody that's interested in that. So back to the topic of today, Andrea is going to spend about 35 minutes sharing insights. She welcomes engagement through the chat and the Q&A throughout the webinar. And so please post your questions at either the Q&A or in the chat, and we'll do our best to get to them. Enjoy the day with Andrea, and I look forward to hearing about transparency statements. Over to you, Andrea.
Thank you so much, Nicola. I'm very excited to be here sharing some of these insights from this research that Nicola introduced so well. So I'll be talking about how transparency statements can improve interactions across power disparities. And while I'll be focusing on the context of law enforcement, I do believe that these insights could translate well across lots of different occupations. So the research really starts from this question of why authority figures so often fail to form rapport with those over whom they have power. There's lots of reasons why we would think that it would be helpful for, a boss to form some rapport with their subordinate, or, a physician with the nursing team that they work with, or of course, in the context that I'll be looking at, law enforcement with the communities that they are serving. Yet, as we know, in the context of the US, trust is at an all-time low. I think it's hovering around 50% of the United States has trust in law enforcement, which is an all-time low. low. And of course, that's even more pronounced lower amongst those who are from historically over-policed communities of color. So I'm going to jump right in, and I'm going to ask for some audience participation in the chat. I'm going to share with you a transcript from the field experiment that I'll be sharing with you today. And I'll just ask you to sort of pay attention to kind of the back and forth that's happening between this officer and civilian, and just kind of put some thoughts, any observations that you have in the chat as you're sort of seeing this. So the officer approaches the civilian, says, "Hey, can I talk to you for a second?" Civilian, "Yes, I'm officer with the police department. What's your name?" Civilian, "Are you a student?" "Yes." "Yeah, is it okay if I sit down and talk to you?" "Yeah." "Cool. Did something happen?" No, I just wanted to talk to you." "Oh, just wanted to say, hey, did something happen?" No, nothing happened. No, just wanting to talk to you. Say, hey, hi." So again, just curious if you have any observations, anything you notice at all about this conversation. If you could just put your thoughts in the chat. No right or wrong answers here. Just curious for anyone's observations. Creepy, mistrust, hesitation to engage, profiling, vague. The opening introduction was scary, off-putting. Civilians hesitant, very suspect of the interaction. Apprehension, probably from minority community, no reason, does seem a bit creepy. Asking personal information before providing his own name. It was an issue for the cop to talk to them. Good student has not shared the name, not clear. Yes, absolutely. So definitely great that people are kind of picking up on what we're building to. But as you can sort of see, there's a lot of questions, there's a lot of apprehension on the behalf of the citizen. And as you can see, one thing I just wanted to note is you can see it's a very imbalanced conversation as well, right? The civilian is providing one-word responses. Whenever they're actually providing more than a one-word response, they're concerned. They want to know if something happened. They want to know why they're being approached, why this interaction is happening. And even though the officer is trying to reassure them that they just wanted to talk with them, clearly the citizen, the community member, is not buying that. All right, so as you can see, there was a lot of apprehension. And so these results that I'm about to share with you will not be surprising. So we recruited a sample of about 100 Chicagoans. So a lot of the field observation aspect of this that I'll be reporting comes from the greater Chicago area. That is where I did my PhD. And so that's kind of where I was on the ground with my collaborators getting started with this work. So because we had done so many observations in Chicago, we recruited another sample of Chicagoans who reported that they had had an interaction with the police within the last year. And we just asked them to describe, what happened in the interaction. And then after they described what happened in the interaction, we had them report what they were thinking and feeling during the interaction. And this is just a word cloud kind of representing the most frequent words in this sample of civilians. And so larger words represent feelings that were present in more of the narratives. And so perhaps unsurprisingly, based on what you just witnessed in that one transcript interaction, we see a lot of words popping out like nervous, worried, confused, upset, anxious, right? So a lot of the most common words that people describe feeling in their interaction with the police is this sort of sense of anxiety. And they don't know why they're being approached. And to just sort of present those results in a different way, right? There is a lot of negative affect, but it's not driven by sadness or anger. It's primarily driven by these anxiety-related words. So we sort of are starting here understanding from this place that community members are very anxious and very nervous when they're very confused when they're being approached by a law enforcement officer. And so it's particularly troubling because as I think Nicola even mentioned in the introduction, billions of dollars have actually been spent to encourage interactions like the one that you just saw as part of community policing initiatives, right? So community policing starts from the idea that law enforcement officers, police officers should know their community, should have sort of long-standing relationships with their community, and that when they have these relationships, when a crime does actually occur, community members will feel more comfortable actually reaching out to the police and reporting and kind of working together with the police to solve these public safety issues. However, there has been some systematic reviews and meta-analyses of, research testing these community policing initiatives, and there is no evidence whatsoever of improved community relations or public safety. So this is clearly a problem. We're pouring billions and billions of dollars into this problem, yet not having the hoped for returns. So now I want to share with you another transcript from the exact same field experiment that is going to look a lot different than the prior interaction that I shared with you. And again, I'll ask you to sort of reflect on what you're noticing and put your thoughts in the chat. So we're not going to start with the beginning of the interaction on this one. We're going to actually start minutes into the interaction. So this is an interaction that's already been kind of happening for several minutes. And so we start kind of drop in the middle of the conversation, the community member saying, "Are you here all summer?" Officer: "Yes, I'm here 365, it feels like. I'll probably see you then because I'll always be at my job every day for some reason. Working those doubles. You're so funny. But okay, I'm going to come in and just say hey to you now because I feel like, I'm at the front desk. Just come. You'll just need it to get through the day, honestly. Yeah, to just switch it up, flip it up. No, you should definitely come in. I'm always at the front desk. I will. Next time. I'm working tomorrow. You work tomorrow? Yeah, no, I actually do. I'm going to come say hey. Yeah, come say hi, literally. Okay, well, it was nice to talk to you. It was nice meeting you. See you later." So again, thoughts. What are you noticing? Just any observations in the chat. I would love your thoughts. Friendly, definitely. Casual, yeah. Cordial, comfortable, openness, good rapport, caring. Absolutely. Yeah, this interaction looks a lot different than the one before. And so then kind of reflecting on the two transcripts together, what do you think makes the difference? I'll tell you what we decided, but I'm curious just any interaction thoughts that you have comparing these two back to back. The tone is very different and the interactions, absolutely. Well, I will explain to you what happened. Yeah, guided more by the civilian, difference in preconceived notions. Yeah, where the conversation took place. Okay, yeah, there's always a lot of thoughts about kind of what might be driving this difference. Oftentimes people think it's a different officer. It's the same officer in both transcripts. So just a very different tone of the interaction. Same community of people that was drawn for this study. So there's always a lot of thoughts, same area. So we'll get into it, but yeah, everyone always kind of has guesses as to this is a different officer, this is a different community, this is a different location, exact same study, exact same location, exact same community, exact same officer. So we'll kind of talk about what makes the difference here. But just to get a little bit more into the context for this research, as I mentioned kind of at the top of the talk, people are very distrustful these days of the police, and for good reason, right? There's lots of high-profile incidents of police brutality, and this often leads people to think that this negative history in the US of these police-community interactions has caused irreparable harm, right? It's just not possible to come back from where we're at, and there's no way to feel anything but threatened or anxious, as we saw in those narratives of Chicagoans who have been approached by the police. And of course, this is something that is particularly pronounced in communities of color, right? This harms disproportionately communities of color because they cannot trust these institutions of their government, which are intentionally meant to sort of protect and aid them, right? If you ask most police officers, they say their primary duty is to protect and serve, yet we know that that is not how most community members feel, and that's particularly pronounced amongst those who are in these historically over-policed communities. However, what I'll share with you today, and hope I can convince you today through the research that I'll be sharing with you, is that change actually is possible. And because the solution that we've come up with is relatively simple and costless, we feel as though it actually offers the possibility of being implemented with fidelity to the nearly 1 million officers across the US. Again, sort of starting with this bottom-up approach of if we can make these interactions go more smoothly, perhaps that can have this bottom-up effect on increasing trust in community members. So I'll start right away with this observational research that we did in the field. And we like to sort of understand our context. So we started by doing lots of ride-alongs, sort of observing these natural interactions between police and their communities firsthand. And we did this sort of qualitative observational phase to then sort of help us develop some hypotheses and test them in this field experiment that I'll share with you next. And as I mentioned, we did our PhDs at Kellogg at Northwestern. So a lot of these observations come from Chicago. And of course, Chicago is frequently in the news as having, lots of issues between police and their community. So we began, just with a very different context, right, with the Northwestern University Police Department. It is, they are all sworn officers on that police force, but of course, very different types of interactions that they're having with Northwestern students primarily. Then we moved over to Evanston Police Department. That is the city where Northwestern is located. It's also actually quite diverse. So there is sort of the east side of Evanston near Lake Michigan that has lots of mansions and things like that. But then sort of on the west side, kind of west of the train tracks, a very diverse community over there. And then Chicago Police Department, we also did lots of observations down there. And of course, that is extremely diverse. And we were in this district that was one of the more diverse districts in Chicago. So lots of different contexts for these observations. And we kind of had consistent insights across these different observations. So we did about 500 hours of observation across these 3 different departments, and really had a lot of insights arise from these observations. And so what that looked like is over 40 4-hour ride-alongs. So we basically one summer 2019, got to essentially pretend to be police officers. We would ride every day with different officers and sort of just observe them on their day-to-day work. All of their interactions that they were having. We would approach the community members after the fact and kind of ask them their thoughts and feelings about the interaction that they had just had. Of course, we also talked to the officers about their thoughts on the interaction. We also did over 50 interviews with officers, and this was across about a year and a half. So we would kind of check in with them, do an interview every 6 months. And then we also got to sit in and be a fly on the wall on these strategy meetings that this group of officers would have, and they would sort of debrief and talk about kind of the problems they were facing in their area. And then of course, this is supplemented by lots of phone calls and informal conversations that we would have with officers over time. And so this is something that started way back in 2017. So we've been working on this for about 6 years now. So even though, relationships between police and community were very tenuous, even in 2017, of course, it's been a really interesting time to continue doing this research beyond 2020. And so as we sort of gleaned insights from this observational phase, it led us to sort of develop some hypotheses, as I mentioned, and design this field experiment that would hopefully yield some insights on how employees working for these historically coercive institutions like the police force could use some concrete conversational strategies to swiftly, build that trust with strangers. They're always speaking to people. Most of the time, they have never met this person before. And so what can they do immediately at the outset of the interaction to kind of make that interaction go more smoothly? All right, so the first I'll share with you kind of some insights from this observational phase of the research. And so a couple different themes emerged as we kind of watched all these interactions unfolding over time. One sort of prescription that chiefs of police have, they understand that their officers are not being perceived well by the communities. So oftentimes what they would recommend is simply increasing interactions, increasing non-enforcement interactions, get out of the car, do a business check, just, go to public places where people are hanging out, like in the park or something, and just sort of chat with people and try to form those connections. However, as we sort of saw in that first transcript, this is essentially a strategic failure. It didn't often go as well as officers thought it might, So they would oftentimes, again, as you sort of saw in that first transcript, approach people hanging out in public areas like in a park and start sort of peppering them with questions like, how are you doing? What are you up to? Again, the intent being to form rapport, and of course, behaving very politely, behaving very respectfully in their tone. But what we had observed when we would debrief with the civilians after the fact is they felt just like that sample of Chicagoans I shared with you earlier. They felt confused. They were wondering if they were being harassed. They didn't understand why they were being approached. And so we kind of observed from this that respectful treatment is not enough, right? It's not sufficient to just behave in a friendly manner, to have sort of a polite demeanor. It's not going to be enough to sort of put community members at ease, especially when everyone in the US sort of has this predominant experience of a proactive or aggressive style of policing. Another really interesting observation that we had in one of our ride-alongs, again, an officer who was just kind of driving around. So if you have ever been to Chicago in January, you know, it's quite cold. So this is a sub-zero day. And we were driving around and she had observed a man sitting in a park, right? Sitting on a park bench, and she was concerned about him. She was worried that he was just sitting out there and it was so cold. So she wanted to check on him. But the way that she did this is roll down the window of her car and yell out the window, "Hey, you okay?" And then the man replied, "Yeah, why?" And then she said, you know, "Just checking, it's cold." So she does explain her intent for reaching out to him, but as you can see in that civilian's response, they're already kind of anxious and concerned. So another kind of insight that we have from this observational phase is these late explanations. Sometimes officers would explain their good or positive or benevolent intentions, but they would wait to do that until it was already too late, right? We already sort of have evidence that the community member was feeling anxious, threatened, unsure why, you know, the officer is speaking to him. And so it's already too late, even though they are providing an explanation. So across our observations, we got lots of evidence for a couple different things that were happening frequently that were sort of undermining the rapport building intent of these conversations, right? We had late explanations, we had ambiguous intent where, you know, the officer never clarified why they were speaking to the civilian. We had sometimes officers would sort of explain, you know, the Evanston Police Department has this initiative to sort of form trust, but that's still not telling you personally why you're being approached. They wouldn't sort of explain themselves often enough, or, you know, they would have this evidence where they were sort of kind of anchoring on their own perspective and assuming that the interaction went well, when in reality, when we spoke to the community members, they did not feel the same. Now, what we observed in Chicago was this brand new unit that was really trying to take a new spin on community policing. And so what they did in this program is actually took beat officers and took them away from the radio. So they weren't having to respond call to call. They were actually assigned to a very specific beat within a district, and they were encouraged to sort of form those relationships and actually kind of try to solve longstanding problems. And so we got to observe a lot of different types of interactions in this new sort of upstart community policing unit. And so now I want to share with you one interaction that really had a different tone to it and sort of made us generate this hypothesis for the study that I'll share with you next. So these actual two officers, this is a photo of the two officers. They were kind enough to let us share that photo. They went to a teenager's house. So again, they are not tied to the radio, so they're able to kind of form these connections. And a few days prior to when they went to the teenager's house, they had met this teenager out on the streets and had noticed that he had particularly beat up shoes, right? His shoes had lots of holes in them. They were very worn out, but he couldn't afford to sort of purchase new shoes. And so they had decided that they wanted to purchase new shoes for him and then deliver them to his house. So they went to this teenager's house and they knocked on the door, and the mother of the teenager answered the door. And of course, as many of the civilians that we've seen so far, she was very concerned why these two officers would be knocking on the door looking for her son, right? But this officer began right away when he greeted the mother, explaining himself very clearly, right? He said, "Hi, we're just here to drop off a gift," and explained the purpose of this interaction right off the bat. And then, you know, the interaction proceeded, and by the end of the interaction, it was very powerful. The mother said something along the lines of, "This is what Chicago police should be about." So again, just starting with this very different explanation right up front could potentially have this benefit of sort of putting people at ease and paving the way for that trust to be formed. So this was what led us to sort of generate this idea about transparency statements, which was just the sort of authentic and genuine articulation of your good intent for the interaction, just stating it clearly, honestly, right in that first statement, right in that greeting. So after this sort of observational phase, we then wanted to, you know, being the quantitative researchers that we are, we had this idea that transparency statements could work, but we wanted to test that in an experiment so we could kind of draw these causal conclusions. And so of course, by the time we got to this point, it was a very different world, and we had a lot of challenges even finding a police partner who'd be willing to work with us on this research, right? This was in 2021, so this is after George Floyd's murder. The local police department had actually recently been voted to be defunded. It was in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic, and we were actually having a huge issue with police turnover, officers exiting at high numbers. They, are not feeling good because they understand that the public sort of has this very negative view of them. But of course, given all of these challenges, police at the same time were very eager to do things that could help restore trust with their communities. And so ultimately we were able to find a department that was willing to form this research practice partnership. And so we looked around the community to try to find outdoor locations where we could sort of stage these interactions, have real interactions where police interactions occurred frequently. So we involved local community members and rank and file officers to kind of scout locations in the area where police interactions would be expected to be frequent. And so we picked out 5 different locations that were actually in the community where officers indicated that they typically would have interactions with the community. They were sort of separated from each other so that participants couldn't see one another and understand the purpose of the study. And then that is kind of how we went about recruiting participants. So we, again, wanted to try to make this as representative of the community where we were running the study as possible. So we recruited using a number of different methods. We pulled people from streets nearby, from Craigslist ads, emails throughout departments at the local nearby university, and word of mouth to try to really get as representative a sample as possible. We ended up with a sample that was relatively diverse, but if I have time, I'll share with you the results of another experiment that we did that was nationally representative of the US. But you see we have quite a good sort of diverse representation of different racial demographic groups. And this is kind of what the experiment flow looked like. So because of sort of being able to consent participants, so they knew they were in an experiment, but they did not know that they were going to be approached by a police officer. They were just told to kind of hang out outside, sit around, and let sort of the natural outdoor nature of the study kind of what happens happen. So that was kind of how we got around it. But because we sort of designed it in this way, we were able to equip participants with a wearable device that would sort of track their physiological responses, so we can kind of get their actual physiological threat responses. We also equipped them with an iPad that was audio recording the entire time. So we also have the actual transcript. That's how I kind of shared those transcripts with you at the beginning. So we can do some language analyses on the actual language in the interaction as well. And then of course we had civilians kind of filling out a survey after the fact. So again, as participants entered into the study, we had them take a seat and just sort of sit and kind of capture a baseline measure of their physiological responses, like their skin conductance levels before being approached. And then about 2 to 5 minutes after they sat down, they were approached kind of seemingly out of nowhere by a uniformed police officer. This is a uniformed officer with, the badge and gun and everything. And we had about 230 interactions in this study. And then we manipulated the introduction that the officer used. So every other aspect of the conversation was natural. It was not controlled by the experimenters. We just told them in the control version, sort of the baseline business as usual version, to just start a community policing interaction as they naturally would if they were in the field. So that often looked something like what you saw in that first transcript I shared with you. Hi, I'm officer name. How's it going? Can I talk to you for a minute? In the other version, we had this transparency statement condition, right? And so the only thing that we changed in this version is that they added about 10 words just explaining their benevolent intent right at the start of the interaction, right? Hi, I'm officer name. How's it going? I'm walking around trying to get to know the community. Can I talk to you for a minute? And of course, because officers have discretion with how they initiate interactions, we kind of told them the general idea, we explained to them what a transparency statement was, but we let them sort of customize it to what would feel natural for them. So there's, lots of different variations of this. They all, again, sort of achieve the same goal of communicating that benevolent intent, but, you can see there is some variation. So officers are able to kind of make this work for them in a way that feels natural to them to speak, right? I'm walking around talking to people in the community. I'm just trying to get to know my community better. I'm getting to know everybody that's hanging out in the area. All of those were sort of valid according to our transparency statement hypotheses. So they had this natural interaction. And then after, the officer left, a research assistant then approached them a few minutes later with a brief survey, asking them about their sort of thoughts and feelings and reactions to this interaction. So now I'll share with you some of these key results that we have from the survey measures. So we, of course, wanted to make sure that officers were being transparent in the transparency statement version. So we had participants fill out some measures about, how transparent they felt the officer was, right? The officer I talked to stated their intentions for talking to me immediately. We also assessed how threatened the civilian felt in the interaction, right? It had included several items, but one example item is, how likely was it that the officer did not trust you? And then we also assessed the civilian's trust in that officer, right? So, again, several items, but including items such as this officer would go out of their way to help you. So now I'll share with you the results regarding perceived transparency. And so we have sort of the version, either the control kind of business as usual or the transparency statement condition on the x-axis there. And then we have perceived transparency on the y-axis. So higher numbers mean that the officer was more transparent. And as you can see, we had a significant effect here. So officers were following the instructions, they were doing well. And civilians who were in this transparency statement version did perceive that the officer was significantly more transparent when they began with a transparency statement than when they began with a sort of business as usual introduction. Next, I'll share with you the results regarding threat. So now, again, a lower number is going to be better because it's going to indicate that the civilian was less threatened. And again, we see evidence that the civilians report being less threatened in the transparency statement version than in the control condition. And finally, I'll share with you the results regarding trust. And again, here we want higher numbers, right? Higher numbers indicate greater trust in the officer. And again, we sort of see evidence that when the officer began with a transparency statement, the civilian reported feeling more trust in that officer than when they sort of started with that business as usual approach. Now, that was really encouraging to get these sort of survey responses, but if you'll remember, as I mentioned, we also collected some other measures, some more unobtrusive physiological measures and language measures, because those are not things that community members can easily control. So we really wanted to have these physiological measures because police and other researchers who studied police were sort of skeptical of these self-reports, right? Because, as we sort of started with the talk, law enforcement officers have a lot of power over community members. And so there could have been some sort of, demand effect of officers, like civilians not feeling comfortable, even though we explained we were a separate research team, that this wasn't going to be reported back to the police department. People perhaps maybe calibrated their responses because they were worried to say if they didn't actually trust. But that is kind of addressed by these physiological measures of threat that we were able to collect. And it's okay. You don't need to understand the in-depth aspects of this physiological skin conductance response, but I'll just show briefly the interpretation of kind of what this looks like. So again, we have time in the interaction on the x-axis, and we have skin conductance response. So people's skin conductance level during the interaction. And then higher levels indicate, sort of higher activation. But you can see just visually a very different pattern between the transparent interactions and the control interactions. So transparent interactions with the blue line, control interactions with the red line. And so what we see is an initial engagement in the transparency condition. And this sort of represents a challenge response. So, objectively being approached by a police officer is a very, threatening sort of high stakes situation for most folks. But there's lots of research that suggests that you can actually approach that sort of difficult situation with either sort of a challenge approach or a threat approach. And a challenge approach is associated with, much more positive outcomes than a threat approach. So again, kind of consistent with other studies that have looked at this sort of threat challenge appraisal approach, having this initial engagement is actually a really positive sign. And then you see that they actually have this very steep slope and a very quick return to homeostasis, indicating that, after they sort of have this initial appraisal of like, I can handle this, that's what a challenge approach is really indicating, they then sort of return to calm, sort of neutral state and have the interaction. In contrast, you see a really different pattern of results when you look at the control condition, right? They're sort of disengaged initially. They're sort of trying to avoid the threat. And then they're sort of slowly increasing over time as they sort of realize, oh no, I can't get out of this interaction. I'm trapped in this interaction with this officer. They're sort of becoming more and more threatened over time. And this is just another way to sort of represent those results in that transparency condition here on the right. The last sort of set of results that I want to share with you is our linguistic analyses, right? So I mentioned that we audio recorded the conversations, and we are able to sort of use what's called natural language processing to analyze both the officer and the civilian's language during the interaction to see if that also has consistent evidence that people are feeling more positively in the transparency condition. So we measured officers' linguistic tactics. Again, we only controlled sort of the first statement that officers gave. So we were interested to see kind of what the officer's language looked like in the first third of the interaction that was not that transparency statement. And we saw evidence that there's this dimension of a natural language processing algorithm that represents language that sort of maintains power disparities and hierarchy. And perhaps unsurprisingly, we saw that on average, officers are using a high degree of language that actually sort of maintains those power disparities. It's using things like we and our and sort of these pronouns, essentially, that sort of again, like sort of reflect and maintain power disparities. And then we measured rapport using the civilian's language, sort of in the final 2/3 of the conversation to see if their language was more positive and more authentic. So another natural language processing algorithm that we're able to use actually has been validated to detect receptiveness to sort of opposing points of view or, validation of others in a conversation, in a high stakes conversation. Another outcome that I won't share with you is just sort of how much the officers and the civilians are actually matching their conversational style. And then of course, in our survey, we also had a measure of empathic accuracy. But for the time today, I'll just share with you the results regarding receptiveness, though the results look very similar across these 3 indicators of rapport. And so again, we're going to, on this interaction, have sort of officers' use of clout language. So this is that high power language. And then we're also going to look at the 2 different versions, right? So the control with a red line and the transparency statement version with a blue line. And again, on the y-axis, higher numbers reflect the civilian's language was more receptive to the officer, and lower numbers indicate that they were less receptive. And so what we see when we plot the results is that there is a very different effect of transparency versus control, depending on how much the officer's language sort of reinforces those power disparities. But I want to draw your attention to this sort of upper left-hand corner of the graph. So when the officers started with a transparency statement and reduced their use of language just naturally, this is not something that we controlled, that reinforces power disparities, we see the max sort of receptiveness on behalf of the civilians. So we're kind of working on follow-up research to sort of develop more concrete conversational strategies to try to make sure we can kind of maximize the efficacy of these transparency statements by ensuring that officers not only sort of start with a transparency statement, but also reduce this language of reinforcing power disparities. Now, in just the last minute that I have, I'll share with you this other experiment that we ran. It was using a video prompt, so not as in-depth or real life as the natural field experiment that I shared with you, but the benefit here is that we could recruit a very large sample that was actually representative of the US. So, we saw that we had a good gender and racial distribution in our field study, but it was relatively small. So of course, as I mentioned, we wanted to make sure that this transparency statement intervention works equally as well, if not better, for historically over-policed communities. And so that was kind of the purpose of this study. So we recruited nearly 1,000 participants to complete the study online, the same sort of outcome measures that you saw in that field experiment. But we had participants sort of imagine that they were in a public place, imagine that they were in a park, and that an officer approached them. So trying to kind of mirror the dynamics of the field experiment as much as possible. And then we showed them a video of an actual officer initiating an interaction. And they, of course, we had 2 versions that we randomly presented to participants, and it was very similar to the transparency statement intervention from that field experiment. So either the officer sort of started very ambiguously, hi, I'm officer name, just walking around to see how things are going, or they started with that transparency statement. And I can see if it will work. I can give you a snippet of what this sounds like.
How's it going? I'm Officer Ferris. I'm out here on foot patrol, just trying to get to know my beat and my community.
So that's an example of what participants were actually exposed to in this interaction. And then we wanted to see, again, if this actually worked, if this worked differently for people from majority racial groups, so, white individuals compared to Black and Latinx folks. And so we did not sort of see any evidence consistently that the transparency statement works differently for white individuals as it does for underrepresented minority individuals. Now, in the cases that we did sort of see evidence that it worked a little bit differently, it actually was very encouraging to us. It looks as though it actually works better for underrepresented minorities. So you can see in the red line here is the reactions of underrepresented minorities, and the blue line, the racial majority members. And this is actually sort of a measure of how willing the civilian feels they would actually initiate an interaction with the police in the future. And so you can see that the slope is stronger and more positive for the underrepresented minority folks. So this at least gives us some initial evidence that transparency statements are working well for both groups of individuals, and if anything, actually having a more positive effect on those from underrepresented racial groups. And so in the kind of ongoing research, this is a big sort of area of my research. And so we have lots of studies happening in this space. Of course, we started out with non-enforcement interactions, but we're very curious to see if this will actually be able to be generalized to other types of interactions. Most, civilians, the typical time that they are interacting with the police is an enforcement interaction. So we wanted to see if this will actually work in enforcement interactions as well. So this is a study that's actually currently happening right now. We're partnering with Sergeant Henderson. She's a sergeant over at Evanston Police Department. And we're doing transparency statements in a traffic stop setting. So Evanston has a big hands-free, no using cell phones while driving. So this is the context where civilians are being stopped in the, the normal course of officers' work who are actually violating this hands-free initiative. And in every case, the civilian is given a written warning. Unless, of course, the officer has the ability to enforce the law, if anything, if there's outstanding warrants or anything like that. But presuming it's sort of the only thing that's happening, the only violation that's happening is this hands-free violation, every civilian, no matter what kind of condition they are in, they're at the end of the interaction given this written warning. But we're manipulating, again, how the officer introduces that. Do they just sort of do a business as usual traffic stop? Do they provide a transparency statement? And then we're actually adding sort of another layer to this. We're actually having this, in one version, we're having them sort of start with a transparency statement and then actually kind of back up their words with actions by having the officer actually give them this public safety item, which in this case is a cell phone holder, right? So that can actually enable them to sort of work hands-free, drive hands-free going forward. And so again, we're aiming for about 300 traffic stops total. This is a study that we're currently running right now. So we've got about 120 as of a couple of days ago. So we don't have the results yet to share with you. But the real thing that we're very excited about with this study is that we're also going to have body camera footage, because the officer begins their body cam whenever they're having sort of an enforcement interaction. And so that'll not only enable us to do that linguistic analysis that we did in this prior field experiment, it'll also enable us to sort of analyze body language and other nonverbals. And then, of course, we're having a researcher ride along with the officer and kind of pop out of the car and ask them to do a brief survey after the interaction happens. And then, of course, we're seeking to also develop field experiments where we're developing a training on this transparency statement intervention and see if it can actually have sort of some of those bottom-up effects that I was mentioning. If all the interactions that civilians are having in the community with officers are these ones that are beginning with a transparency statement, does that kind of have broader macro community level effects? And so we do think this is sorely needed, because this is a chart that's actually pulled from the communication unit in the police academy of the police officer partner that we had for the field experiment. And so they actually say that, body language and tone of voice are most of what matters in an interaction, and the content, like the words that you're actually saying, are only 7% of what matters. And at least, I hope with the results that I've shared with you today, that it does seem that the words are actually a little bit more than 7% importance. And we do think this has a lot of ability to actually be trained. When we presented this work to a chiefs of police conference in the fall, we actually had a chief approach us after, he'd been on the job for 45 years and had a really positive reaction to the transparency statement findings. He said, "This is perfect. We've been telling people for years to just go out and be friendly. This is something that I can tell my rank and file guys. It can be short and easy to remember." So again, we think this has a lot of potential to actually be trained. And so I'll just close out the talk with one of my favorite findings from the field experiment. So again, if you'll remember where we started the conversation today, it was how the predominant sort of reaction of community members is this really threat, anxiety, and there's this kind of lay theory in society that there's just been too much harm done by officers to ever have, any positive interactions or any positive outcomes of an interaction. But that is not the case that we saw in our field experiment. So one of the measures I mentioned is that we actually had civilians kind of report their thoughts and feelings throughout the interaction. And at the end of the interaction, participants who were in this transparency statement condition, they actually reported being inspired significantly more often than folks in the control condition. So this was, really not something we necessarily predicted at the outset, but when we saw this, it was really encouraging to us because it's not only that transparency statements kind of reduce negativity, it also seems that they have this ability to potentially inspire community members and really sort of lay the groundwork to form that trust going forward. And with that, I'll just thank, it takes a village to do research like this. These are my collaborators, Kyle Dobson and David Yeager, a wonderful team of research assistants and all of our police partners. And I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thanks so much, Andrea. And there are some questions that have come in. So let me just see what I can do. So can you share how the officers felt about the study in terms of enhancing their sort of self-growth and their safety?
Absolutely. I'm really glad that you asked about that. That's something that we're also really interested in. I only had time to kind of share a subset of things that we're interested in. We're, of course, really interested to understand the effect that this has on officers as well. We only had about 8 officers. So these were 8 on-duty officers who helped us out with this field experiment. It doesn't give us enough sort of statistical power to really say definitively how they reacted, but we do feel as though the officers did report sort of feeling better or feeling more positive when they were doing this transparency statement intervention compared to their kind of control. Like they could kind of pick up on the fact. So one of the measures we had is this empathic accuracy, sort of having the officer predict how the civilian was feeling. And we actually saw that officers were picking up on that positivity from the civilian more so in the transparency statement version. But yeah, absolutely. We're super interested to kind of study that more systematically going forward, because as I mentioned, one of the challenges with this research is that police are exiting at high numbers, right? They don't feel good that they have this really negative image in the public. And so we absolutely think this is something that could have a positive sort of feedback loop on officer wellness as well. And that's something we'd like to test more systematically going forward.
That'd be great. There are a couple of questions around both the racial makeup of the officers that participated in the research and were the results consistent based on the race of the officers serving the community, and were there any gender issues discovered based on the gender of the officers?
Yeah, that's a great question and one that we get often as well. So we did have officers of both genders in the field experiment and officers of different races as well. Again, as I sort of mentioned, the same issue we have is not having kind of enough statistical power to really dive into that systematically. However, what I can say is that, we control for officer identity in all of our results, and it kind of holds. So, there's perhaps you might have some predictions about that. One of the female officers we had in this study, her average rates of trust and threat were, her average rates of trust, no matter how she started, were very high. People generally really liked her, but we still saw that difference. So it's really encouraging for us, because oftentimes when we talk about these results to officers, some people feel like they kind of attribute it to personality. They're like, oh, I could never be like that. You need to have sort of a certain personality to really be able to form that rapport. But when you look at our results, you can actually see, even if people sort of have different baseline levels of ability to find rapport, that it's actually still being boosted in the transparency relative to the control. However, we definitely, and the officers also, that just from our observational phase, a very diverse set of officers, white men, Asian men and women, Latinx men and women, Black men and women. So we have observed a lot of officers of different racial groups, different genders, and sort of seen evidence of this. But again, it's something we need to test more systematically going forward.
And I'm not sure if Gary asks, what is the follow-up in terms of the officers having maybe a coach to work with them for this growth? How do you see the follow-up? And I actually had a question too around how do you put this research? What's the path to do that? You talked about being at a conference, but what is there sort of a more direct route from research to practice?
Yeah, absolutely. So we're very interested in that as well, because again, as I sort of mentioned, we think this is one of the benefits of this is obviously there's lots of things that can be done to sort of reform police. And, there's a lot of top-down approaches happening now with like changing the culture, but we think this is a really nice complementary thing that officers can have in their toolkit to just be able to sort of make change on the ground on an individual basis. So we are in the works of developing an actual training module, like a police training academy. We had the opportunity to observe the training academy, like this is sort of scenario day, they call it. So they have the cadets actually kind of pretend to go call to call, and they have role players actually enacting scenarios. And again, it's very similar. It's meant to sort of model a real day on the job. They don't know exactly what they're being dispatched to. And so we got the opportunity to observe that just a couple months ago. And that really gave us a lot of insights on how we can sort of develop this training and perhaps actually institute that as part of Training Academy. We're also working, it's really fascinating. The chief of the University of Georgia Police actually has a PhD in adult education, which is so fascinating to me. And so he is one of our partners on this ongoing effort to actually build a Training Academy module. And then of course we would be training the trainers. So officers are a little trepidatious of researchers. So we would train, actual police officer trainers to actually train this. And then the idea would be to train a whole department on these transparency statement approaches, and then kind of follow up with like the community level sentiment over time to see if this is having sort of a more broadened effect beyond just sort of each individual interaction.
That's great. Michael says, does this research aspire to somehow measure how the visual effect of the armed officer affects the feelings and interactions? So he says, I have to believe the gun, handcuffs, club, and taser have some impact on establishing trust and anxiety and ultimately the interaction.
Absolutely. And so that's why it was really important to us that we actually had these uniformed officers in the field experiment, because that, again, we absolutely think that's something that's driving the threat and anxiety that participants community members are feeling when they're being approached by an officer. So that's why it was super important for us to have it be a real on-duty uniformed officer, not like an actor or, sometimes officers will wear a different uniform if they're kind of on a community policing beat. But we wanted to sort of show that this is something that can even work for a uniformed officer. And so we're really encouraged by the fact that even a uniformed officer with the gun and badge, we're still able to sort of see the benefit of this transparency statement. And there is a lot of conversation in police departments about, whether or not they should have their community policing officers wearing the same or a different uniform. So that upstart community policing unit that we observed in Chicago, that was a big conversation that they had at the formation of that unit. And they ultimately decided that they wanted their officers to be wearing the standard Chicago Police Department uniform, because they sort of had this lay theory that maybe that would lead people to sort of generalize, like, this isn't a special Chicago police officer, this is just a Chicago police officer. And perhaps that means that I can, if I have a good interaction with this officer, perhaps that means I can trust other Chicago police officers as well. So yeah, I think there's a lot to unpack there. And it's something that we are thinking about, and officers and police departments are thinking about as well.
So Jeff asks the question that's on my mind around, can results of the study be applied outside of law enforcement, for example, in the medical industry, manufacturing, marketing? And are there any specific behavior changes that a typical manager can apply to improve their image, their brand, their interactions, and their level of trust with people?
Absolutely. And so, being the management researcher that I am, I like to study law enforcement as sort of my organizational context, but I absolutely want to make sure that the through line is there and people see the connection, because I absolutely think this applies beyond just the law enforcement context. I think the law enforcement context is a particularly sensitized version, right? Like, the coercive power that a police officer has over a community member is very salient in the community member's mind. But anybody who has power, a boss, a manager, a physician, over somebody else, like the coercive power aspect is, present in the lower power person's mind. So, when I've given this talk before to other academics, I've heard lots of anecdotes kind of connecting this to other forms of power disparities. So for example, when I presented this at a different business school, they said, the faculty members said, "Oh, are you talking about our dean? Because our dean will," not the dean of our lovely business school.
Our dean.
This is a different business school. They said that the dean often will just pop unannounced into people's offices. And the goal is to really actually, the goal of this dean is to try to get to know the faculty better and, to really try to form that rapport. So very kind of similar context, but of course, the faculty members expressed, confusion, and they're like, is this really, just a pleasant interaction that they're trying to have? Or are they trying to evaluate me? Is there any sort of evaluative component to this? And I think that is what's looming large in a lot of these other contexts, right? If a boss just tries to casually ask a subordinate about their weekend or something like that, perhaps they really just have this intent to form rapport, but the subordinate is going to be kind of wondering in the back of their mind whether there's any other kind of ulterior motive. So again, I think, using a transparency statement, again, customized to, that particular interaction is something that I think has a lot of promise for other interactions across power disparities as well.
And one very quick last question, Andrea.
Mm-hmm.
The research looks like it's focused on the initial interaction between the police and civilians. So when you think about different sectors, when you think about business or healthcare, et cetera, oftentimes, there's multiple interactions over time that you're trying to develop with, between a manager and their subordinates, et cetera.
Absolutely.
Done any research around the transparency statements over time and how to build that trust?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question, and something also that we're really interested in. We haven't studied it systematically. As I mentioned in the field experiment, we really just wanted to see what the effect of sort of starting with a transparency statement is, and then we let the conversation flow naturally. But if you'll remember, in the observational phase of this research, one of the key themes that we saw popping out in our observations is infrequent explanations, right? So the conversation is happening, and perhaps multiple conversations happening. And the officers that we saw that are really good at this naturally, they actually explain almost every single word that comes out of their mouth. Like they're like, "Hi, I'm officer name. I'm just trying to get to know the community today. I'm going to ask you a question. And the only reason that I'm going to ask you a question is just because I want to try to get to know you. There's no ulterior motive here," right? Like, so at each step of the interaction, they're actually explaining themselves really well. And we've seen some really powerful body cam footage of officers who do this really well. Like, "I'm going to walk closer to you now, and that's only because I can't really hear what you're saying. And so that's why I'm approaching you. I'm going to walk slowly." And so again, I do think I don't have, a systematic experimental evidence on this, but at least from an observational perspective, I've absolutely seen officers who do this really well, and they're explaining themselves. They're using a transparency statement essentially every step of the interaction.
That's fabulous. And we'll look forward to hearing more about your research, Andrea, as you develop it, because this is really critically important. So thank you so much. I'm going to hand over to Tammy to close us out.
Yeah, thanks, Andrea, so much. That was really great information. And I think what I took away from this, if nothing else, is that transparency statements are a way to reestablish trust and accountability between police and the communities that they serve. But we can also see that carries over into the business world as well, between managers and their subordinates. So thank you so much for that information. Just coming up, looking ahead, we have our next Business Over Breakfast session that's taking place on May the 4th. Is on the topic of why behavior science hasn't been working for you and what you can do about it. So join us on May the 4th with Professor Ryan Hamilton as he shares information about that. And going forward, would just like to share some of our short courses with you. We have our Goizueta Executive Women's Leadership Program, as Nicola mentioned at the beginning. This program helps to focus on the critical skills and competencies proven to elevate individual capability and confidence. This is a hybrid offering. It starts August the 15th through September the 21st, Applications are being accepted now, and the deadline for those applications are July 28th. We also have a pre-event. If you're interested in learning more about the Women's Leadership Program and meeting one of our facilitators, you can join that event on Friday, April the 28th. It's a complimentary webinar that's taking place from 12 to 1 p.m. You can reach out to me for more information about either the program or the pre-event. And finally, we do have some free 4-credit MBA courses. That semester starts August the 23rd through December the 5th. These are in-person, virtual, as well as hybrid offerings. We are currently accepting applications for those as well. The deadline is also July the 28th. The focus on those topics are finance as well as marketing. So again, please feel free to reach out to me. You can email me at the email address here, or to send it to our Goizueta email address for more information on those and other short courses. Again, we thank you for your time today. Thank you again, Andrea, for all of the great information. Everybody have a great rest of your day. Thank you.